I was out yesterday and the day before, and I am seeing irises popping up in people's yards. They're not there. I'm seeing a flush of green on our oak trees. I'm even seeing beautiful little sycamores sticking out their buds and saying, I'm alive, keep me. So what we're looking at is there is always, fire is often a regenerative process, especially in Southern California. And we are going to see, if you walk through Eaton Canyon ever, you have already seen 100-year survivors of many fires. And what we have to remember is we have to give nature time to heal. And that's what we're trying to do. And the little group that we formed is called Altadena Green. We're trying to make sure that the trees that are there that you need to keep, that the Corps is going to work with us to keep it.
Fountain grass is one of them, so that's Pasadena. That one we do still see people planting it because it's aesthetically pleasing. But in terms of the way that it functions in our landscapes, it produces high volumes of seed. They can spread for miles, and then they pop up anywhere that there's a site disturbance, like a road, a construction site, a burn scar. And in those places, these plants can reproduce really rapidly, and then they dry out during the summer months, and they're what we call a flashy fuel, meaning they ignite very quickly, and fire can spread through them very quickly. It's a very different vegetation type than a lot of native plants.
Okay. Pampas grass, which is another popular landscaping ornamental.
Oh, this grass just seems like it thinks too much of itself.
Yes, it kind of does actually though, but it's a tall stalk with a big white floofy plume of seeds, and I did an exercise, I'm an educator, so I actually did an in-person class where I gathered both fountain grass and pampas grass from my neighborhood and brought them into the class, along with some native plant cuttings, and lit them on fire. I didn't test the pampas grass ahead of time, and I probably should have, because just the first spark in this huge, even faster than the fountain grass. But they spread really easily, and they're all over, they get into wild spaces, they spread into other people's yards. And I know specifically for fountain grass, just doing a little research looking at, there's an app called iNaturalist that people use to identify plants, and it goes up into a database. Just to look at the neighborhood and the hills surrounding how much fountain grass was out there. And it spread from homes. So if we don't plant those in our homes, then they won't spread into the wild, into other places as well. Just less fire fuel.
Okay.
If we can look at which plant species are locally native, those are going to offer us most resiliency because they're best adapted to our specific site. And they're also going to offer us the most support for wildlife, for biodiversity. So I would encourage us to look at locally native plants and to not think of them as individual species, but to start to recognize the historic plant communities that exist in these spaces. So here in Pasadena and Altadena, the historic plant communities are going to be chaparral, southern oak woodland, coastal sage scrub, and then in areas like Eaton Wash and the Arroyo Seco, we also have riparian plants. Those are plants that are adapted to live near creeks and streams. So these are the plant communities that we want to be reintroducing into our built spaces to offer us the most climate resiliency and to best support wildlife habitat.
Let's be honest, plants are going to burn. We put enough fire to them. But there are plants that burn quickly, and many of the chaparral plants are part of a fire regime. And they will burn, and they will keep their 2-foot deep root system in, which is going to hold the soil in place and will allow them to come back quicker. You don't want a fire-resistant plant will not continue burning. It'll burn quickly. If you have plants that'll burn and burn and burn and are hard to put out, That is what you have to be careful of. Anybody out here named Rosemary, I'm sorry, I'm so true, you probably don't have a whole lot of oil. But if you have a lot of oils in the plant, they do burn longer. So you have to look at some of the characteristics of the plant you're bringing. And the rosemary comes from a Mediterranean climate too, but it's not meant to be in the burn regime. So those are some of the characteristics that are really important to look at. And we have Cal Fire and other, I would say, state agencies. Arnesia Nursery has a list of the plants that do best in our fire regime that we should look at. But also, we're talking about the physical space, where it is in relationship to your house. It's just as important as the plant. Okay?
Sure, yeah. So Stephanie alluded to something called defensible, like fire escaping defensible zone theory. And so this is when we're talking about landscaping during the design phase. So we're deciding like where do we site our structure in the first place? And then from the structure working our way out, we have different zones that we treat differently, and we use different plant material within each zone. So in the immediate zone, like within 5 feet of a structure, we're trying to create an ember resistant zone so that if embers land there, there's nothing for them to ignite. So we're looking at materials like concrete, decomposed granite, gravel, and if we're using plant material, we're maybe using low growing succulents. And then within 30 feet of the structure, that's our defensible zone. So we're actually looking for plants in that space that really like to hold on to water. So we are looking at succulents. If we're maybe looking at select native plant species, this is also the zone that if you're going to have turf, this is an appropriate space for that. If you're going to grow vegetables, this is another appropriate space for that, because we are constantly irrigating turf and vegetables, so they're holding a lot of moisture. If embers land on them, they're going to tend to fizzle out. Then in that 30 to 60 foot zone away from the structure, that's where we start looking at probably the broadest range of native plants that are appropriate, because we're creating a green belt in that area, and we're looking to apply minimal supplemental irrigation to get the most, like the best hydrated plants. Native plants are going to be able to reach sufficient hydration with the least amount of supplemental irrigation.
I could give some examples for that final out there zone, which are some of the plants that you would find outside of the neighborhoods too. Toyon, laurel sumac, or coast live oak trees. These are ceanothus. Another one, plants that are evergreen and have sort of thicker leaves, and you can, even in the middle of the drought, they're still holding on to some moisture, that even when it's been 8 months since it rained.
All right, so we're really looking at how do we meet this intersection, right, of fire resistant, but also climate resilient landscaping. So we are going to use supplemental water. We're going to need to use water, but we want to leverage the use of that water as efficiently and effectively as possible. So we can do that by first selecting plants that are well suited to the site conditions to begin with. Those are going to require the least amount of inputs from us. Then from there, we can also be looking at how do we leverage our earthworks for stormwater management. We have this free resource of water that comes out of the sky, and our infrastructure historically was designed to shed that stormwater, and we're starting to realize that that may be erroneous, and it may be much better for us, where possible, to try to capture and infiltrate that water so that our plants can uptake it and be well hydrated. So we're looking at that stormwater management component of using bioswales and rain gardens wherever it's feasible. And then when we do apply supplemental irrigation, we're concentrating the highest use adjacent to our structures. And then in general, especially when we start looking at our green belt, we've picked those plants that need the least amount of supplemental irrigation. They might even survive without an irrigation system, but we can help them thrive and stay well hydrated if we do have permanent irrigation installed, because we want to be able to use that during drought years to supplement rainfall. And during the summer months, we can use it to provide light permanent irrigation, just sufficient enough for them to stay hydrated enough to withstand firebrand attack.
The issue with the water, right? And why it's a do not drink. I'm not sure what the current status is and the various Altadena water districts.
There's like 5 water districts and they all are sort of like right next to each other, so your neighbor could have water and you would not. But the supervisors noticed that Altadena, the Altadena Council, last meeting, which was on the 25th of February, has a great recording of that meeting, and they will, all 5 water districts are talking about what they're doing. They can talk about it better than I can, but I highly recommend if you want to know what's happening with them and how they are on this recovery. That's a terrific video. They don't have a single bit of toxicity in any drinking water. So it's going to take time because they want to make sure that you're safe. That is the highest priority.
Probably one of the main issues is going to be heavy metals in the ash and then entering the soil and entering the plants. And the way that plants incorporate heavy metals into their tissues is almost exclusively into their leafy structures, not into their fruiting parts. So I would get a second opinion about whether or not the lemons themselves are safe to eat. Anything that you're eating the leafy part, you would definitely want to make sure that your soil is healthy.
I've done some research too. I'm no expert on removing heavy metals from soil. I know there are certain plants that you can even use to help mitigate that and suck that up. But as far as compost is one of the things that can absorb the volatile organic compounds and heavy metals. Also biochar, a garden type of phosphate. And they're all just materials that absorb those toxins and can be used to help remove that from the yard. Will that completely remove it? It depends on how much ash and how much is now soaked down into the ground from the rain that we've received. Those are a combination of items that you could start with, and then I would recommend testing the soil. I just got a kit off of Amazon that only tests lead, but I'm kind of using that as an indicator of other things.
There are very few labs that actually do the testing for the heavy metals. Unfortunately, Wallace does an agricultural testing. The dilemma with what you have is that if you could have the ash removed without going to the 6 inches of soil, you're going to mitigate it continuing to seep into your soil, and then you put mulch on it. That this will then allow whatever is in there to sort of be absorbed by the mulch. So you are minimizing the infiltration of some of these toxicities. Loyola has, their scientists are asking for people who want to have their soils tested over okay, so good. Over a period of time, you count a test clock. They will measure it now, and then they will measure it in 6 months, and then they'll measure it in a year.